if I get boring, you can always take me out, right?
No, I'll figure something. All right, I always
Okay.
do. All right, we're joined this hour by Lee Beck. This is really exciting. Lee is oh wow, he's a performance artist. He's a writer. He's a playwright. He's a experimental playwright. He's an improvisational artist, a troupe leader of sorts. He's Lee Beck. Jeez. Really, really excitedly. So before we get started about all the different hats you wear and all the different ways you wear it, let's get started before we get started. Let's get started before the beginning. How did you get involved in the world of improvisational theater and um,
Improvisational theater. Well,
improvisational experimental? How did you become the man known as Lee Beck?
I don't know. I think as far as improvisation, I started pretty young because I don't know. I was just thinking about it the other day. My first gig was a maypole celebration in my grammar school at the age of 10, and they chose me to be the MC for some reason. I guess they had already perceived that I had kind of a gift of gab, or as I call it, mic ability. So I did that, and once I did that, I never could stop. And I always got gigs, and I was always the guy they came to be MC their shows in grammar school and high school, and then in high school I really got into it, and I could just I don't know, I could think of something and go out there in front of the whole student body and make it up as I went along, and had really good luck making it funny, and I could make them laugh. And I joined a group of guys, 3 other fellas, and we had kind of a quartet. This was just as the hit tune Tom Dooley was breaking. So we love satire, and we did a satire on Tom Dooley, and that was a lot of fun. And it was right around the time, it was 1959, that I graduated from high school. That was my last year. And in that year, we had Fidel Castro take over Cuba. And one of our guys in the band was running for commissioner of entertainment at the high school. And we dressed about 25 guys up like Fidel in army fatigues with beards drawn on them. I had a beard myself, a black beard back then. And we marched into and we were very naive kids, of course, but we were, Fidel, he inspired us. At that time, we were very inspired by Fidel. That was before he was declared some kind of an enemy. And we admired him because he took old Batista and threw him out of government. And Batista was an incredibly corrupt guy. And Fidel and the people rose up and kicked him out. And so we dressed about 25 guys up like Fidel, and they marched into the high school auditorium before about 2,000 kids, whistling Bridge on the River Kwai. Da, 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 da. I don't know what the teachers thought of that, but it was a big deal, and it was a lot of fun. And then I played the interpreter for the guy that played Fidel, and we had a lot of fun with that. So that was kind of where I got started doing improv. And all that time, I was also being raised in a very fundamentalist religion that was encouraging me not to get involved in anything like that, or in the real world at all, or in the the world of entertainment and that sort of thing. Back then, things were really, really fundamentalist, and it was a very close-knit group. I was in a church called the Church of Christ, and we defined ourselves by the fact that we had to use 1 cup on the communion table. So we were called the 1 Cup Church of Christ. Everybody drank from it because the Bible says he took the cup, he gave it to them, they all drank of it. And we took that literally, as we did many things that we interpreted in the Bible, or as my parents were converted to it when I was about 8 years old. I have whole stories about this and routines about it that I tell, and songs about it. I wrote a play about my life as a fundamentalist because I grew up, and it was kind of unspoken, but I knew all along that I was expected to be a preacher because I had that gift of gab. And I was advised that I got a scholarship right out of high school to a Baptist college, and I was advised that that would be dangerous because it would be dangerous to have a liberal education. And so I didn't go to college, and instead I traveled with an evangelist. When I was growing up, my father was a preacher. He was a very charismatic guy, and he started a church right there in Sacramento where I was raised. Out on Auburn Boulevard, we took over a cleaning establishment and made it into a church. And then preachers would come through the country, and they'd always stay at our house, and they would stay and preach for 10 nights in a row. We call those gospel meetings. And we'd have gospel meetings. And we also did not believe in musical instruments in the church, so it was all a cappella singing. And I got to where I led songs, and I gave my first talks in church when I was 12 years old. And by the time I was 17, I was touring around Northern California, preaching at churches all around the area. And then when I graduated from high school at 17, I started traveling with this evangelist and traveled all over the United States, and eventually was preaching 50 nights in a row sometimes, coast to coast and cover to cover, as I say.
So how wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I've had a lot of eventful things.
How did you pick up?
Huh?
How were you different? How are you similar, and how are you different from your father in terms of your preaching style?
Well, I think we both had kind of a charismatic way about us, but what I really loved to do and what I got into as a young preacher was I loved to tell stories, the Bible stories, and then make applications to people's life and help them see how this could help them in their lives. And eventually, some people began to object that I had a little bit too liberal of a delivery. My subject wasn't literal enough. Our motto was, "We speak where the Bible speaks and are silent where the Bible is silent. We do Bible things in Bible ways and call Bible things by Bible names." And I don't know, eventually that just didn't add up for me, the fundamentalism of it all. And
yeah,
I began to change, partly because I had my second son. I married very young. My wife was 18, I was 20. And we had 2 children by the time I was 22, 23 years old. We had 2 sons. And our youngest son was severely retarded and epileptic. He had a seizure every 10 seconds. Either a petit mal or a major, seizure. And we kept him at home for 6 years before we had to put him in a state hospital in Sonoma, where 2 of my brothers worked and friends of ours were doctors there. And then we visited him there and eventually moved him to Sacramento. He died at the age of 29. So, so that was a big deal. And then during that time, I always say I lived 100 years by the time I was 27, because during all this time, my values were changing. I went in, my first church was in the Panhandle of Florida, right in the heart of the Ku Klux Klan. And I got involved in starting a black church there and set up a tent out in the country at a fellow's place. He had come to my church services on an Easter Sunday morning. And this gentleman asked me if I'd come out and start having church with him and some of the kids out there, where he had some property under a grape arbor. And of course, I was happy to do that. And I went out there, and then quite a few people came. So we got a tent from a church that was sponsoring me down there in San Antonio. And I got an African-American preacher who I had discovered just across the border in Sampson, Alabama, doing a lot of preaching. Got him to come down, and he and I rode around for a couple of weeks, passing out flyers, advertising this gospel meeting out there. And of course, because I was a young white guy and he was a little older fella, a little older than me, maybe 10 years, but a very experienced fella, really articulate. He had one arm, and he was a great guy. And we set up that tent. And on the 9th night, we went out there, and the tent was burnt to the ground. And but prior, building up to that time, I had been threatened, and people had threatened to run me out of town on a rail. And I wasn't involved at this time in the civil rights movement per se. But at that time, I had already seen I was aware of it, but I didn't have a lot of political awareness then, although I always kind of followed politics and was interested in it. And of course, my politics would have been kind of conservative at the time, right along in there in terms of the candidate. My candidate, my first candidate was Goldwater, until I went to a Goldwater rally in Fort Worth, and that convinced me he was no longer my candidate. Just the rah-rah and the flag waving and all that just turned me completely off. And but anyway, we went out. Our church was burned down right during the civil rights movement, and then after that, I kind of got out of the South and went back to California, where I had a congregation in San Luis Obispo, and our second son was born there, and our oldest son was born in Florida, and he now lives in Sacramento. And I have 4 grandchildren, 2 of them blood relatives, my son's sons, and 2 of them are adopted into the family, and so like that. So that's how I got into it. And then in high school, like I say, I did a lot of improv and with this band, and had a lot. And I did theater. I did some plays. And the first thing I did after I quit being a preacher was go to college at American River College. I just couldn't get to college soon enough. And it just, man, my mind just started opening up like crazy. I remember, whenever I think of that, I think of the effect that studying cultures of other countries, other people's cultures and things had on me right at that time. Because there was a lot of education that I knew nothing about, and all of a sudden the whole world was opening up for me. And this, of course, radicalized me, this and the people I was hanging out with. And at one point, there was a sheriff in Sacramento County named Mr. Lee, and he was a real son of a bitch, and he was arresting a lot of the young people. And we had, it was in the very early days of FM radio, and we had developed a radio station there called KZAP, which came from the top floor of the Elks building in downtown Sacramento, which at that time was the tallest building in Sacramento. And a bunch of acid heads and young people, they took over that building, and they had the rights. The guy that owned the radio station, he lived down in the Bay Area, and he just said, "You guys do whatever you want." So they started playing really great music, and that station became kind of a focal point for all the young people in Sacramento area. I was a little older than a lot of them. I was a little pre-baby boomer, really, because I was born in 1941. But where was I at? So yeah, so
okay. Well, tell us about what it was like going to Barry Goldwater rally. I'm kind of curious about that. Far away from that.
Well, I had gotten a gospel meeting in Fort Worth, Texas. And at this time, my child was still having seizures constantly. I had a very young family, my young wife and my 2 little boys and me. And they put us in a motel way over on the other side of town. And it just was not a warm feeling, even in the congregation. I don't know if they were already thinking I was becoming too liberal, or if they were just that way. I have a feeling they were just kind of that way. They were more staid than I was used to, and a little less social than the churches that I had worked with and been with and was raised in. Because in my home congregations, we were like a big family, and we'd often have gatherings after church and sing into the night and have potlucks and play with all the kids. And, it was a very familial kind of a thing. But at this particular place, it was not. And like I say, I was becoming more and more interested in politics at the time, because I was very conscious of this racial, when I started traveling in the South and seeing terrible conditions in the major cities in the South. I was raised in Sacramento, which, you know, there weren't even African American kids in my school. The only guy, there were a couple of Jewish kids and a couple of some Latino kids and some. There was one Hawaiian guy, but other than that, you know, it wasn't that. But when I started traveling in the South and I saw these incredible, I mean, this was in late 50s, early 60s. It was just terrible. And then there was segregation, you know, you had to go, you know, they had the men, women, and colored around back, and black people had to come to the back door and all this kind of stuff. And so all of a sudden I was dealing with all these kind of things. And so I started getting interested in politics, and I thought, and I liked kind of the independent attitude of Goldwater. I think these kinds of politics appeal to fundamentalists, kind of, you know, these individualistic, you know, because when you're a fundamentalist, of all the people in the world, you figured out that you had to have one cup on the communion table, and that musical instruments was a sin, you know, and a lot of other stuff. And so it kind of helped. And my grandfather really got my family into it. He was a devotee of that. And he had it, he was so fundamentalist that he had church in his house because he really couldn't fellowship hardly anybody up in Redding, California. So anyway, so I was there in Fort Worth, and I decided this was a big step to go out into the world, as we called it, and take a look at Barry Goldwater for myself. And I went down, I heard he was in town. I went down to a big convention center, and I just slipped in there to see what was going on. And everybody was wearing red, white, and blue hats. You know, those little straw hats, you know, and there was tons of flags, and it was all rah-rah. And I don't know, I just, I wasn't raised to, you know, we practiced non-involvement in politics in my church. My dad didn't even vote after he got converted. He never voted until Clinton ran against Bush 1, which was much later in life, and I was already an adult. And he rose up out of his sickbed and voted against Bush because deep down he was kind of a Rooseveltian Democrat. His family had basically been saved by Roosevelt's programs. My dad was the oldest of 12 kids. And so he had a big appreciation of Roosevelt. So he saw Bush and his attitude, especially about race, because I don't know if you remember, but Bush 1 actually used a black man who was had been, I forget the fellow's name.
Willie Horton.
Willie
Horton.
Yeah, Willie Horton. Yeah, it was the Willie Horton thing, and they used that to beat the shit out of to try to, and the fact that's how Bush had won in his first effort. But anyway, it turned that against him, and then he liked Clinton, I guess, because he was kind of Jesus-y. He was Jesus-y enough from the South anyway, and so he voted for Clinton. I don't know if he continued to vote after that, but he spent the last 10 years of his life pretty sick and on Percodan a lot because of his illnesses and stuff. Yeah. But that day was a seminal day because I had turned my head around. But I already had a visceral dislike for LBJ. That was another reason that I didn't. I had a vivid memory of sitting on a front porch in Healdton, Oklahoma, when I was a very young preacher, and watching Meet the Press. And LBJ was on the program with a couple other guys. And, you know, I don't know, just my youthful perception, I just believed everything he said was bullshit. and that was part of why I liked Goldwater better. And then Reagan made a great speech, and that kind of inspired me for a little while. But then later I became very anti-Reagan, not just Reagan, but anti those kinds of principles that led to a lot of bad stuff as far as I'm concerned.
So tell me about, I'm kind of interested. Yeah, you come out as like, evangelical, background. You have a very you have these kind of tendencies against like it's kind of push for equality. You're marching around as Fidel Castro. You see segregation, you see Jim Crow. You want to do something about it. And yet you have these like really strong libertarian tendencies at this point.
Yeah, I would say libertarian was, around Sacramento, if you were what they called a leftist, you were more of a libertarian than you were, unless you were, really knew politics and understood things well, you would kind of lean towards libertarianism at that time. I didn't even realize it was libertarianism until I was much older, after I moved to LA and became really involved, because once I got down here, I became more and more radicalized politically for myself. Not that I participated in a lot of stuff here, and through our theater company, we did theater based on that, so it was.
Well, no, I'm curious though, like to hold these two thoughts, these ideas of, that you wanted it, you were inspired by people who would like stand up to, to the powerful and corrupt, right? And then you would also.
And I always was for the underdog too. I was always for the person that everybody thought wasn't any good or no people didn't like. I always tried to make a point of getting it. I guess that was part of my Christian indoctrination, but I took it seriously. And my dad, he was that way too. He would often bring home hitchhikers and stuff that nobody else would do. I remember one time he brought a hitchhiker home, and a preacher and his family was staying with us. And the preacher got real pissed off at my dad for bringing this guy in the house and having him stay a couple of days while he and his daughters and his wife were there. And in our family, that was considered really weird of a preacher to be objecting to us bringing in a stranger who was in need, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But maybe it was nowadays it would be maybe more foolhardy than it was then.
Well, I think that it seems like, the question, I guess, is just that you had, always for the underdog in the snap, but then the two politicians that spoke to you at an earlier iteration of your life were Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. So it says something. Well, they have something in common, right? Which is this kind of like, the bright shining city on a hill, and we can do it. And it's this kind of John Wayne kind of.
Yeah, well, as I came out, I also had a Billy Graham phase of my, where Billy Graham started making sense to me. I was in the Astrodome when LBJ and Lady Bird came to the Astrodome, and Billy Graham was preaching there. I went to one of his rallies there, and I kind of passed through that part, and then eventually I read a book written by a lot of ex-Church of Christ preachers, and one of them lived there in Sacramento. He was a blind minister who had a Christian church there, a very liberal Christian church, and I started meeting with him, and he started just blowing my mind with his theology, and he had degrees in theology and Latin and stuff like that, and I would go and read Bonhoeffer and Kierkegaard and all this stuff to him, and we would talk about it. And he kind of just, gave me an education that I never, that I might have gotten had I gone on to seminary. When I quit, I had considered very strongly going to a, like the Pacific Seminary in San Francisco, or to a very leftist or liberal seminary, and continuing being a preacher. But the more I got up on stage and performed, preaching was total improv all the time. I had maybe 50 sermons. I had little notes, but most of the time I extemporaneized. After I had preached a lot of those sermons, 50 times, I could pretty well say them without, and I could deviate, I could make up stuff, I could apply it to the moment. And so I developed some really good skills in that part. And so, and then when I really started going to college, I was telling you about this Sheriff Misterly in Sacramento, and everybody was upset about him. And one night I was babysitting my kids while my wife was out, and I just started improvising being a guy who was running for sheriff, I came up with a character named Cecil Higginlooper, and I decided to go down to when she got home, I went down to a coffee house where one of the guys from the high school, from the college, was doing actually in a community church, in the attic of a community church. And I went down there and just got up on the stage and started campaigning as Cecil Higginlooper. And then I took questions from the audience, and I had them all in stitches because it was satirical and funny and fun. And I really got the bug then, and I never stopped after that. And pretty soon this guy and another fella who just actually passed away, Tom Schmidt, a wonderful clarinet player, he and Paul Emery from who's now in Nevada City, and he's still in the arts. Tom just passed away about a month ago. And I hooked up with them, and we did a poetry thing about Guadalcanal and the poet. There was a guy named Guadalcanal or something like that. But anyway, we did a poetry thing, and I did the comedy part, a sketch with a bunch of stuff, and it went over really big. And then I don't know, somehow we had there was a big demonstration in San Francisco, right? Anti-war demonstration. By then, I was in the movement. I mean, I had gone down and marched in the first march in Sacramento against the war with two of my fellow students who had burnt their draft cards, and we marched down to the post office to burn their draft cards from Sac State. I was going to American River College, but the rally was at Sac State, and I went there, and I was one of the speakers, and then we marched from there. There were 200 of us. I'll never forget that, because as we marched, it was something that I don't know if it had ever happened in Sacramento. Certainly not much before this. And we marched down to the post office and burnt the draft card, and that encouraged a lot of people to come up and discuss the whole thing with us, the war and all this kind of stuff. And so then we got invited to play a flatbed truck in front of the City Hall in downtown San Francisco in a big rally. And by this time, I had already quit the church, but as I was coming out of the church, I started selling vacuum cleaners door to door. Whenever I would go away and travel, I would preach every day, but when I came home, I had to make a living. So, and I had to make a living where my time was my own, because I had gigs being a preacher. So I had this dichotomy going of becoming a door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesman. And at first I sold Kirby vacuum cleaners, and then eventually I sold the Rainbow vacuum cleaner, which is one that used water. And I got really good at it. I mean, I sold lots of Rainbows. I got to where I could sell almost every one I ever pitched. And I made $100 every time I sold one. So I'd just go work 3 or 4 hours in the evening with a buddy of mine. And I would make a living for my family, and I'd be able, and I enrolled it. This is while I was going to college. And back then I had a beaded headband and long hair, black hair, and I'd go around knocking on doors looking that way. And I had a lot of luck selling to what we called juicy lieutenants out in Rancho Cordova. We could drive around and see the stickers. Well, they were juicy lieutenants because they just got out of college. They just got married, and they just got a great job learning to be an aviator, what do they call the guy that there's the pilot, and then there's the guy who tells him where he is. I forget the name of that gig. But anyway, they were learning to do that, and they were getting ready to go to Vietnam because it was in the early stages of the Vietnam War. And so I could really justify getting money from them to pay for my life, because I was trying to do just the opposite of what they were doing. So I started selling those vacuum cleaners, and I turned it into an act. And I pitched my Rainbow vacuum cleaner on this flatbed truck at the anti-war rally, and suggested that as the answer, the ecological answer to all our problems, a rainbow on every corner. And of course, the rainbow, and all that, it was called the Rainbow, and that caught on. And And it was funny and fun. I had little white pads I'd throw up in the air. I'd put the vacuum cleaner in my pants and make a joke about that and tell about how it sucks. And then I'd pull it out and shoot these things out of the air. And it was a very dramatic show.
All right. So your interest in historical fiction started early.
Well, when we did that show on the flatbed truck, KQED invited us to come and do a show on KQED FM. So we did. And we did a show where in the end of the show, during the show, there's a big zipper behind me. Of course, this is all on radio. And on radio, you can paint any kind of picture you want. And so we unzipped the zipper and out flew all these canaries. And we were all going... and there would be all these canaries, and then the canaries picked up the tent where it was a pseudo gospel meeting because I was doing satire on my years as a preacher, kind of. And after that rally in San Francisco, I got dubbed as Brother Lee Love, and they started calling me that. And we carried this tent above the city of San Francisco, and we told everybody to go to their windows and look out and watch us flying by. And then right after that, KZAP Radio invited us to do a weekly show. So I started doing a weekly Sunday night show called the Survival Revival Hour with Brother Lee Love. This was 1968, 69.
Have you ever considered suing Vince McMahon?
What?
Have you ever considered suing Vince McMahon?
Vince McMahon?
Yeah.
No. Who's that?
There was Vince McMahon is the owner of a company called the WWE, also formerly the WWF. And in the WWF in the 1980s, there was a character called Brother Love.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think he snatched your idea.
Oh yeah, no, there was even a guy who played in Las Vegas called Brother Lee Love.
Oh man.
So a lot of times I got credit for being places I wasn't.
Oh, that's hilarious. So to tell us about some of the work you did, how did you form, moving smoothly, how did you form the Public Works improvisation?
Well, after I did Brotherly Love and the Survival Revival Hour, and then my band and I, which was called the Greater Carmichael Traveling Street Band, eventually became known as the Backwoods Jazz Quartet. And I wanted to do theater, and they wanted to do music. I love music, but eventually we played a place up in Sweetsmill, a folk concert up in Sweetsmill at a folk camp. And at that camp, we met a band called The Frontier. And our band fell in love with their band and vice versa. And my friend Mitch Greenhill wasn't with them. So we met again a few weeks later in Berkeley and met Mitch. He wasn't there because his oldest daughter was being born. And he's one of my very longest lifetime friends at this point. And he just, in fact, came out with a wonderful book about his days. He was managing, his father managed Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, and was friends with Woody Guthrie and all those guys, Taj Mahal, Muddy Waters, Big Mama Thornton, a bunch of them. So then his band, eventually when my band was kind of wanting to just go off and play music and not have me in the show per se, his band wanted me to manage them. So I began to book his band, that band, The Frontier, and traveled with them for a couple of years doing that, or for a while doing that, and building lifetime friendships and stuff. So, but eventually everything played out for me in Sacramento. I just, my son kind of grew up and he didn't really want to hang out with me anymore. He wanted to be with his friends instead of me, and we had been very, very close. And my wife and I had split up because, we got together when we were really basically different people, and we both discovered that we were quite a lot more different than we thought when we grew up. And but I had moved a block away, and I lived in a whole community, and there's a whole bunch of stories about all this. I lived in a community where there were 5 houses and about 27 people, where my band rehearsed in the basement of what we called the Big House on Harmony Hill in downtown Fair Oaks. And I was kind of the unsung mayor of the town for a while, and we performed around there. And I did Easter sunrise services on the old Fair Oaks Bridge as part of our whole program. And I started putting activism and theater together there. I did a float in down the American River to dramatize saving the American River. And then I did a dance around the nukes at Rancho Seco for 7 days and blew my trumpet at it at the 7th day. And I had about 300 people come out there, and we dance around the nukes every day, except on the days when they were having hearings with Mr. Teller downtown at the Capitol building. And I'd go down there, and I'd be one of the people at those hearings. And there'd be a couple of the Manson family there too. They were very anti-nukes themselves, the women that were left, who lived in that area from that family. And so anyway, I just became more radicalized politically. But finally, everything kind of played out in Sacramento, and my band that I had been booking had broken up too. And Mitch had moved to Boston and had been gone for a couple of years, but had moved back to L.A. To manage, to take over his father's company because his dad was getting ready to retire, so he wanted to show Mitch how to do it. And of course, Mitch knew how to do it, a lot of it already, because he was raised around it all his life. So I came down here to see him on my way to Taos, New Mexico. And I stayed around for a while. And during that time, I answered an ad in the beachfront paper for an improv class. And I went down to the church in Ocean Park. And the teacher was a woman named Marlene Rasnick. And we lined up on the wall. And she asked me to roll across the floor with her. And I did. And then I went away for a few months. But I kept thinking about her. And when I came back, I looked her up. I came back to marry Mitch on the merry-go-round at the pier in Santa Monica. I sat backwards on a horse, and he and his fiancée sat frontwards, and I performed the wedding as the merry-go-round went around. And I took Marlene to that with me, and she didn't think that was such a great idea, but getting married on a merry-go-round. But anyway, we did that, and then I started, attending her class, and we formed a little theater company called Wild Rice, but she was in a company called Public Works Improvisational Theater, which had been invited to be at the church in Ocean Park by Jim Kahn, who was a wonderful preacher and a good buddy of mine for many, many years, and eventually became the mayor of Santa Monica back in the, I don't know when it was, 90s, I think. And while he's retired, he's still real active down in that area. But we mounted a whole campaign. At that time, the big issue in Santa Monica was gentrification. It's like it is a lot of places now. And there were a lot of forces trying to build high rises all along the beach and all that, And we did a play called Left of Crystal Pier. And I was invited by the company because I had been doing a lot of improv, and I also was doing some solo shows. And so they liked what I did. So I played 3 different parts in that play. And it was a big hit. And it was fun. And we had a great time. When I first met Marlene, she was doing a play about women and money called Purse Strings. And in that play, they had made it all women cast, thus alienating all the guys who were in public works at the time. And the company was kind of just beginning to break up in Santa Monica. So at the end of Left of Crystal Pier, Marlene wanted to, I was living in Santa Monica, right on the beach there at the Sea Castle, paying $275 a month for a room that now rents for probably $5,000 or $6,000 a month. But Mitch's dad, Manny, got me the room right next door to his, and it was great. I had a lot of fun living there. And prior to that, when I first came down here, I often stayed in Joan Baez's room when she was out of town, because Manny and his partner would arrange that. And they kept me working, painting stuff and digging. I was a good house painter. So with Marlene, I started living with her out here in Silver Lake. And she and I became Public Works, and we kept on using Public Works as our theater company name. And we did many plays and many improv shows together, often with a jazz musician. And we had great fun and great success. And we had a wonderful group of people around us here in Silver Lake. Some of our very best and earliest friends were Jackie Goldberg, who we then helped campaign in her first run for the school board. And then eventually she became the president of the school board and was there for 8 years. She's back on the school board now. And she also got elected to the city council. And we campaigned a lot for her there. And, but, it was always, I always had to work in order to make money, because we didn't make a lot of money doing the kind of theater we were doing. A lot of our lefty friends said, if we lived in Cuba, we would have been supported totally, but we didn't live in Cuba. We lived in LA. And, but we kept doing it. And we had a good bunch of people around us, I'm telling you, wonderful friends and supporters. And after about 20 some yeed, Marlene got ovarian cancer. And then for the next 5 years, she suffered and had a lot of ups and downs. But it was an amazing time. It helped. She really just handled it like a champ. And during that time, she was a viper. She loved marijuana. And we heard of a group of guys in LA who were starting a cannabis club. They were a bunch of mostly gay fellas who had helped to get the first proposition passed to allow people to use medical marijuana. And so they started the Los Angeles Cannabis Resource Center. It was on Santa Monica Boulevard and Vista. It was a 3-story building. And we grew the pot in the basement. We rented out the second floor, and we dispensed on the third floor. And this place was incredible. And Marlene was made the honorary chairperson of the whole deal. And she became a spokesman for medical marijuana. And she was on TV all over the world. And this was when people were just beginning to hear about marijuana as something they could use or might help them and blah, blah, blah. So we participated in that for several years. And then, of course, when George Bush II was elected, the day after, the DEA came and busted the whole place, took all the money, threw all the dirt in the middle of the room. And of course, we did big demonstrations. Jackie came and spoke at our demonstrations we had on the vacant lot across the street. And Marlene, of course, spoke. And it was a wild time, I can tell you right now. And she was very near to her passing at that time. But she had a lot of personal integrity and strength. And she was amazing. And she was able to, get through all that before she passed away. But they shut us down, and 3 of the guys were charged with federal crimes and went to trial. And at the trial, the judge called them menches and gave them the least sentence he could possibly give them, which was a year probation. And so, and then shortly after that, clubs began to spring up all over town. Ours was a collective. These clubs were private enterprise for the most part. And from then on, clubs started. But even as we were going down, we were on the verge of having a stamp on the back of your driver's license saying you were a medical marijuana user and that you would have marijuana in your car and that you might be on marijuana, even. So we were right on the verge of getting that stamp when we got busted. And that was during the time Lee Boek was sheriff. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff about him. But at that time, he was very supportive of medical marijuana. And we would even have, when we had rallies and stuff, he would send a woman from the sheriff's department to come out and testify about their support for this idea. They liked it. And so it was an amazing time right in through there. And of course, Marlene and I kept doing theater and telling stories and doing gigs. and improvising shows with jazz musicians usually. Um, and then, you know, I went, she passed away, and that was really tough. It was really tough. And the response was incredible, though. The whole community gathered around. There were like 10 or 12 people in the house the day she died. And there was a lot of love. And we put some of her ashes in our garden. We're big time gardeners. We had, by this time, when her mother passed away, she left us enough money to buy our house in Silver Lake. And we had a nice garden. We have a nice garden in the back of it. And so I was able to put some of her ashes in the garden that she helped to create. And then I went on, and at first I didn't know what to do with myself. And then I just decided I'd start going to the theater. At that time, I was rehearsing a lot at a dance space on Hyperion. And the fellow there, Larry Brown, was very helpful, and he let me come and go as I pleased during the day when nobody was there. And so I'd go in there and start rehearsing, and I started writing poems and trying to get all my feelings out. And throughout my life, what I did for theater came out of, and all of the work Marlene and I did came out of our life experiences. For example, during our time together, we got very well acquainted with Tony Russo, who was one of the Pentagon Paper activists, you know, with Daniel Ellsberg. And we did a show called Shooting Someone Dancing, which was about the assassination of a professor at Cal State Fullerton. He was shot by one of his Vietnamese students. At that time, there was a lot of very virulent anti-communist attitudes among the Vietnamese in Orange County, for sure. And a lot of their soldiers that had supported the war had been transported to Orange County. So we did a play about some of that. I remember the last line of the play was, "Remember, when you say communist, better say dog, or else you are a communist." So, and that was kind of the attitude. And of course, Reagan was totally behind a lot of that, because he was opposed to any kind of repatriation with the North Vietnamese, and he was fighting against the professor Cooperman, the fellow that was shot. He was trying to get computers to Vietnam, yeah. And Reagan was very much opposed to that. He was trying to stop it. So, and Cooperman was working through UNESCO. And Reagan regarded UNESCO as like an enemy of the people, you know, communist stuff. And there was a lot of communist bullshit in there. So anyway, so that was that. And after Marlene passed away, I started, I don't know, I just started trying to think of what I could do and how I could do it. And eventually I wrote a play about my days as a fundamentalist evangelist called Confessions of a Pulpiteer, and started kind of getting back into it. And while I was getting it up, I also was good friends with Lionel Rolfe, and this is where you came into the picture, because I knew Lionel Rolfe pretty well. He had been my neighbor, and he and my other neighbor and his wife, my other neighbor Paul Greenstein, and his wife Nigel Lennon, they had written a book called Bread and Hyacinths about the bombing of the LA Times in 1910, with a lot of emphasis on the fellow who almost became the first socialist mayor in California and in maybe the United States. Now there had been others in the United States, but certainly in LA. Job Harriman was his name, and Marlene and I also started working at Sunset Hall, which was a home for old radicals on Francis Avenue that had been started by the Unitarian Church. A lot of the radicals from the 30s and 40s, as they got older, they thought it would be fun to retire together. So they bought this kind of really cool place called Sunset Hall, which had a 2 stories all the way around a garden in the center with a fountain, and it had a cafeteria, and it had a big living room, and it had a library. It was a wonderful place, all in old-timey wood. It was just beautiful. And some of my activist friends, because they often tried to keep me working, make sure that Marlene and I had income, so they'd get me paint jobs. I painted a lot of lefty houses, and I also, dealt with a lot of, as people passed away, I dealt with the end of their lives a lot of times in terms of their stuff. So I would go to their house after everything had been picked through, and whatever was left, I could dispense with or keep. So I developed quite a nice little library of lefty books and stuff because from these old leftists, and I got acquainted with a lot of people. And then, of course, working with Tony Russo, we got more and more radicalized in terms of politics as time went on, and more interested in being participants and trying to make things different than they were in the country and so on, and in LA. And so anyway, as I was getting up that play, I wanted to rehearse, but it wasn't like I had anybody to watch me anymore. Before we had people to, I could have gotten someone, I suppose. But anyway, I was getting it up, and I was also working on this LA Times bomb idea with Lionel, and I kept saying, I want to get young people involved. Well, for about 6 years, a fellow by the name of Brian Cross moved in next door to me. He's also known in the hip hop community as B Plus from Mochilla. And B Plus and Coleman were next door all the time. And whenever when I was with Marlene and was having a really hard time, I could slip over there and have a J and talk to these young people. And they just inspired me, and I inspired them, and we became very close. So when I started working on LA Times Bomb, I told B Plus that I wanted to get young people involved in it because I thought it'd be good if they knew about this history of LA. And he thought maybe he could do it, but he's a very busy fella. And so he suggested I get a hold of a guy named Mike Sonkson, Mike the Poet, which I did. And Mike the Poet invited me down to, what's the name of that place we used to have those readings?
Yeah, bro.
Stella Adler Theater. Yeah, remember when we used to have those gigs down there on Monday nights once in a while? And so I started going down there and and I would practice I would started practicing my play. And of course I met you and Armand and Mike and Peter Coca and all these wonderful people, boys and girls. And I decided you guys were the LA Times bomb. And I really connected the two subjects together because I saw what you young people were doing at that time as heading in a very positive direction. And thank God I've lived to see it have a bigger and bigger and wider effect.
Young is relative.
Yeah, well, yeah, because I'm old, but I'm very immature myself.
young is all youth is also, yeah. Youth has nothing to do with age either. So yeah. So tell us about the latest production of the LA Times bomb and what iteration it took on
Well, I was doing a show. I got invited to do one of my story files, which I started doing as time went on. About 5 or 6 years after Marlene passed away, I met my current spouse, Sophie, and she's a very French person and a lovely person. And she and I started doing wine tastings because I'm very connected with wine growers in Mendocino County. My brothers live right in the wine country, and they're all involved in the wine. And the Fry Vineyards, which was the first organic winery a certified organic winery in the United States, that family were dear friends of my brothers and I. One of my brothers lives on the ranch. Some of our kids married some of their kids. And the Fetzers and the Fries and the Becks have all become very close friends. So one night I was over in Eagle Rock, and I decided to stop by and see B Plus. And I had a bottle of Fry wine with me, and I went in there, and he was fixing a really good beef bourguignon, as I recall. And I had this bottle of wine. And while we're drinking this wine and eating this wonderful meal, he said, "You know, a lot of the guys now, a lot of the people now are turning to wine because they'd been notorious beer drinkers as youngsters, but now they were beginning to mature and developing this apparently more sophisticated taste. Although beer also is sophisticated now. But then it was wine was just beginning to kind of burgeon in their consciousness. And I said, well, why don't we do a wine tasting at one of your gigs? Because I had talked to the Fries, and sure enough, they donated the wine. One of the Fry boys, who was related to my family, he came down and did it with us, and we did a big wine tasting at Edgar Varela's place down there on Alameda Boulevard after a gig one night that B Plus and them had. I think that gig was maybe at Cal State LA. There was a series of gigs with big band, and then they went over there and partied till the wee hours. And we supplied the wine, and everybody got into it. We started having fun. And Lily Mueller and Edgar Varela and the artists downtown started loving my wine because they started coming to that. And pretty soon they hooked me up at ArtShare. And I started doing my show Story File there, which I did there for about 5 years, once a month. And Sophie would run the bar. We'd serve Fry wine, and she'd often cook up food, or other people would bring food, and we fed people, and we gave them wine, and we had great shows. And I started inviting all you young poets and storytellers that I knew. And of course, I already knew lots of great musicians, and it just blossomed into a really nice show, and we had a lot of fun with it. And of course, there had already been a tradition of shows similar to that going on around town for quite a few years already. So it was fun to have that, and it was a lot like the kind of shows I like to do, because I had always, all my life, organized variety shows in high school and college, and I'd get 10 performers that I liked. We didn't have to rehearse because everybody had their own thing that they did. I knew who they were and what they did, and I'd just lay out the program and introduce each one of them with a kind of a nice introduction so everybody knew who they were, and they did it. And so that got us going good. And that's how I got into that with you, and that's how I met you. And then last year, or a couple of years ago, I forget, I guess about 2 or 3 years ago, I was doing a show at Plaza de la Raza, and you happened to park right near me. And as we were walking over to do the show, you were in it. You said, Lee, remember that LA Times bomb that you did? Says, I want to do it again, which this was like, for me, it was like a dream come true, because this, to inspire that somebody else, that you would remember it and want to do it again, was just fantastic. And you were in touch with Greg Palast, and he wanted to do it. He wanted to play Darrow. And so we worked on it, the three of us, and we had a really great show at Beyond Baroque. And that was really fun. We did a great job, and we even got invited to play. What was the name of that thing that they invited us to do at Occidental?
Oh yeah, we were supposed to be like the closing act or closing something of a.
It was for the
Left Coast Forum.
That's right, Left Coast Forum. We were invited to do that, and then there was some kind of we were really getting ready to do it, and while we were having a rehearsal, you and me and Greg, we decided to call them up and ask them what time we needed to be there and get the details.
Right.
And they said, "Oh, it's been canceled."
I was going to Cuba.
Yeah.
So we needed to figure out the times.
Right.
But yeah,
So
so it
we
was,
ended up not getting to do it a second time, but we really had a good show that first time. We had a full house, and people really enjoyed it.
yeah,
And of
no,
course, I played Otis, the editor of the L.A. Times, and I had a lot of fun with that. That was fun.
yeah.
So
No, it was streamlined this time, but it was, yeah, that was going to be really exciting. But instead, we'll do something else. I don't know. I mean, there's you know, there's definitely a lot more we could do with that. I mean, I know Kyle.
yeah, I think we'll come back at it again
Yeah.
if we ever get to go outside our houses.
I mean, like we could do it. I don't know, like we could do a Zoom show. I mean, that'd take a lot of coordination, though.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I've done some Zoom things. It's okay, but there's nothing like being there with the people and enjoying the I don't know, just that live performance. I love that. Well, through the years, I've done a lot of live performance. I've also done some television and radio and stuff like that. So,
Yeah. Can you share with us a song from the this
well, my part as Otis starts like this. Why should rich people like us have to pay for poor people like you? You people seem to have the idea that just because we have all the money, we should have to pay for everything. We shouldn't have to pay for everything just because we have all the money, any more than you should have to pay for everything if you had all the money, which you don't. So let's just get off of this trip and simply realize we're rich and we're not paying for your poverty. Even the Bible teaches us that the poor you shall have with you always. That's you. We're rich.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, Lee, it's been a wonderful hour. What can we expect from to see from you in the future? What should people know about? What words of advice you have? How do you want to close it out?
Well, 3 years ago, my house burned down while I was in Paris. On the morning we were going to come home at 11, we were catching a plane. At 4:30, we got a call that our house was on fire over here in the late afternoon. And so by the time we got home, boom, it was burnt. And we're just now beginning to get back into it, thanks to insurance companies and all kinds of stuff. We're maybe within the next 2 weeks, we'll be back in our old home place. So that's the immediate thing for me, is getting back in my house, being able to be back in my garden where I love to sit and read and rehearse and sing and whistle and grow flowers and be with Sophie and have guests over and all that kind of stuff. And of course, all my life I've performed, and I'm going to keep right on doing it. I'll be going to different venues. I'm sure I'll come up with another good idea to perform and be doing some more story files, hopefully, and maybe even another play, and maybe doing my current play again. I just did it a few months ago. I did it at the Great American Theater on where is that? On Wilton. And we had a full house. It was great. It was a lot of fun. I do it with my friend Nolan Porter, who's a wonderful musician and singer and writer. So I look forward to doing more.
Yeah. Well, we're looking forward to hearing more from you. You're really very prolific. You've lived quite a life. You got a whole lot more to live. So,
well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's fun.
No, I had a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
I've really been enjoying watching your programs. They're really, you're doing a good job, and I love hearing from everybody and seeing what they're up to, and it's fantastic. So keep up the good work.
Thank you, Lee.
Proud of you.
Thank you.
Okay.